the assassin hid in plain sight. In 227 BC, in the throne room of the young king of Qin, a man named Qin Shi unrolled a map. The discussion was of territory, of surrender, but concealed within the parchment scroll was a dagger, smeared with a poison so potent that a single scratch meant an agonizing death. The king, just 21 years old, fought for his life, his robes tearing as he scrambled behind a pillar, the blade slashing through the air inches from his throat. He survived. But the man who would become Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, never truly escaped that moment. The attempted murder didn't just threaten his life, it forged his psyche. It convinced him that the entire world was a nest of assassins, and that his only path to survival was to rule it with a terror so absolute, it would choke the very breath of conspiracy. This was not the beginning of a reign of wisdom, but the trigger for a descent into a paranoia so profound, it would redefine the meaning of power itself. What does it take to forge a nation from 7 warring states that had been butchering each other for centuries? The answer, as decreed by the first emperor, was absolute, unflinching, and merciless control. The stakes were nothing less than the creation of China itself, a single, unified empire that would endure for millennia. But this monumental achievement was built on a foundation of psychological terror and systematic cruelty. For every subject, from the highest minister to the lowest peasant, the stakes were equally absolute: obedience or obliteration. The emperor's vision was divine, his methods were diabolical, and his mind was a fortress besieged by its own demons. He sought not just to rule the world, but to conquer time, death, and reality itself. His story is a case study in how ultimate power can corrode the human soul, transforming a strategic genius into a figure of legendary madness. To understand the emperor's madness, one must first understand the crucible that formed him. Born Yingzheng, he ascended the throne of the brutal state of Qin as a child, under the control of a regent. His was a world of constant, visceral warfare. The Qin state operated on a philosophy of legalism, a cold, pragmatic doctrine that stated humans were inherently selfish and must be controlled through strict, harsh laws and severe punishments. Disobedience wasn't just a crime. It was a flaw in the cosmic order, to be purged with fire and steel. From his youth, he was surrounded by plots. His mother's lover attempted a coup. The court was a snake pit of intrigue. The assassination attempt by Qin Shi was merely the most dramatic confirmation of his worldview. Trust was a lethal weakness. His response was to build an apparatus of control unprecedented in history. He created a network of spies so vast that neighbors informed on neighbors, and children were encouraged to report their parents. Punishments were collective. A single man's crime could see his entire family line, parents, siblings, children, executed to eradicate the treasonous seed. This was not just justice, it was psychological warfare, designed to breed a population so paralyzed by fear that dissent became unthinkable. The boy king was gone, replaced by an increasingly isolated and suspicious autocrat, already dreaming of a title that no man had ever dared to claim. The layers of fear and ambition building in the young emperor's mind are just the beginning. To follow this dark journey into the heart of ancient power, subscribe to Forgotten Asia and hit the bell icon. The story only descends further into the shadows from here. But just as his grip on power seemed absolute, the emperor discovered that there were enemies his armies could not cut down and his spies could not unmask. They were ghosts of a different kind, the ghosts of ideas. and his war against them would reveal a new dimension of his paranoia, proving that he feared the power of a scroll more than the power of a sword. With the Seven Kingdoms finally crushed and unified under his banner in 221 BC, Yingzhen took a title that shook the heavens: Qin Shi Huang, the first August Emperor of Qin. He standardizes everything: weights, measures, cart axles, the very characters of the written language. This was a logistical masterpiece, but his motive was control. Variation was sedition. Diversity was a threat. And then he turned his gaze to the past. The emperor became convinced that the only way to secure his new empire's future was to sever it from its past. Scholars, particularly Confucians, began to speak of a golden age before him, using ancient texts to critique his harsh legalist policies. They argued for virtue and benevolence. To Qin Shi Huang, this was not philosophical debate. It was treason. The event that followed was one of history's most infamous acts of cultural suicide: the burning of the books and the burial of the scholars. In 213 BC, he ordered the destruction of all historical records from the conquered states, all classical poetry, all philosophical works, anything that did not praise the Qin state or provide practical manuals for farming, medicine, or divination. The empire's memory was systematically set ablaze. But the physical destruction of scrolls was not enough. The scholars themselves, the living repositories of this forbidden knowledge, had to be silenced. The following year, the emperor accused 460 of his most critical scholars of plotting against him. His punishment was not just execution, but a statement of ultimate terror. He ordered them buried alive in a mass pit, their voices literally smothered by the earth. Some accounts suggest he had them thrown into a newly dug irrigation ditch and covered with dirt as they still breathed. This was not merely killing. It was symbolic annihilation, a warning that any challenge to his absolute truth would be met with utter eradication. The depth of the emperor's paranoia is staggering, isn't it? If you're captivated by this descent into absolute power, please take a second to like this video. It helps immensely in sharing these dark histories with a wider audience. Yet, even as he sought to erase the past, the emperor was becoming consumed by a far more personal and desperate fear. The very mortality he imposed on others now haunted his every waking moment. His war against death would lead him down a path far stranger and more tragic than his war against scholars. A quest that would see him poison his own body in a frantic search for eternal life. Qin Shi Huang, the man who had conquered every human rival, now declared war on nature itself. He became obsessed with immortality, surrounding himself with a court of fangxi, mystical alchemists and sorcerers who promised him the secrets of the gods. He funded extravagant expeditions to the mythical Penglai mountain, home of the immortals, sending out fleets with hundreds of young men and women in search of the elixir of life. None ever returned. His palaces were filled with laboratories where alchemists brewed potions of cinnabar, a mercury sulfide compound, convinced that this vibrant red mineral was the key to transcending the flesh. The emperor ingested these concoctions, little knowing he was slowly, systematically poisoning himself. Mercury poisoning attacks the nervous system. It leads to tremors, hallucinations, and violent outbursts. His quest for eternal vigor was, in fact, accelerating his physical and mental decay, feeding the very paranoia that gripped him. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. He became terrified of being found by death, so he ordered the construction of 270 secret palaces connected by covered passageways, moving between them at random so that no spirit of death could learn his location. No one was allowed to reveal his whereabouts, on pain of execution. He grew isolated, a ghost in his own labyrinth, trusting only the deceptive whispers of his alchemists. The most powerful man in the world had become a prisoner of his own fear, pacing the gilded cages of his making, drinking poison and calling it salvation. The irony is almost Shakespearean. The emperor who sought immortality was killing himself. What do you think drove this contradiction? Share your thoughts in the comments. I find these discussions fascinating. Yet, even as Mercury coursed through his veins and paranoia clouded his mind, the emperor was engineering his most breathtaking project, one that would outlast his dynasty and become his ultimate monument. He had failed to conquer death in life, so he began constructing a kingdom to rule in the afterlife. And for this, he required an army that would never die, never rebel, and stand guard for eternity. The scale of Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum complex defies imagination. For nearly 4 decades, over 700,000 conscripts from across the empire laboured to build a subterranean empire mirroring his terrestrial one. At its heart was the tomb itself, described by ancient historian Sima Qian as a miniature universe, with constellations of pearls on the ceiling representing the stars and rivers of flowing Mercury, replicating the great waters of China. But it was the periphery of this complex that would shock the world millennia later: the Terracotta Army. This was not a mere collection of statues. This was a military formation frozen in time. Over 8,000 life-sized soldiers, each with unique facial features, hairstyles, and armour, arranged in precise battle order. There were chariots, cavalry, and infantry, all facing east toward the conquered kingdoms from which threats to his eternal rule might emerge. The craftsmanship was staggering. These were not servants or courtiers, but an eternal garrison for a ruler who believed his war would continue after death. The psychological drive behind this monumental effort reveals the core of the emperor's divine madness. His terrors of assassination, of rebellion, of the unknown were so profound that he sought to carry them into the afterlife. He was arming himself against spectral enemies for all eternity. The Terracotta Army is the ultimate expression of a paranoia that transcended mortality itself. It was a project of such staggering vanity and fear that it bankrupted his treasury and consumed a generation of labourers, all to serve the whims of a man preparing for a war in a world that existed only in his tormented imagination. The sheer scale of the emperor's ambition is almost incomprehensible. If you're amazed by these revelations about ancient China's darkest secrets, please share this video with someone who loves history. These stories deserve to be told, but reality, unlike his terracotta soldiers, would not remain frozen. As the emperor continued his desperate consumption of mercury-laden elixirs, his body began to fail him, and in his final days, his court descended into a chaos that perfectly mirrored the madness he had cultivated. A madness that would ultimately strangle his dynasty in its cradle. In 210 BC, while touring his eastern domains in search of the immortality that continued to elude him, Qin Shi Huang died. The cause was almost certainly mercury poisoning, the cumulative effect of the very elixirs meant to grant him eternal life. The irony was perfect and tragic, but his death created a crisis that revealed the fatal flaw in his system of absolute control. Fearful of the unrest his death would cause, his chief eunuch, Zhao Gao, and Prime Minister, Li Si, conspired to conceal it. They placed the emperor's body in his royal carriage and continued the journey as if he were still alive. They ordered carts of rotten fish to be placed around the carriage to mask the smell of decomposition. Courtiers continued to bring meals and documents to the carriage, where a servant would pretend to convey the dead emperor's responses. This macabre charade allowed the conspirators to forge an edict, forcing the emperor's chosen heir to commit suicide and placing a weak younger son, Qin Shi, on the throne. The system built on terror and absolute secrecy now consumed its creator. Without Qin Shi Huang's terrifying will at the center, the empire he built through blood and iron began to implode. Peasant revolts erupted everywhere. The very ministers who had served him now vied for power. Within 4 years of his death, his dynasty lay in ruins, his palaces burned, and his family line extinguished. The God King was dead, and the empire he created through divine madness could not survive his mortality. The unravelling of the Qin dynasty is one of history's most dramatic falls. We're nearing the conclusion of this dark tale. Let me know in the comments what you think was the emperor's most consequential mistake. And so, we arrive at the final, enduring mystery, one that has resisted 2 millennia of curiosity and modern science. The central tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the heart of his subterranean kingdom, remains sealed. Ancient texts warn of booby traps, crossbows rigged to fire at intruders, rivers of deadly mercury. But the greatest trap may be the one the emperor laid for history itself. The choice between preserving his eternal rest and finally understanding the full extent of his divine madness. So, how do we judge Qin Shi Huang? Was he an insane tyrant, a paranoid monster poisoned by his own delusions? Or was he a visionary, a brutal but necessary force who forged a fractured land into a civilization that would endure for ages? The answer is that he was both, and it is this terrifying duality that defines his legacy. His achievements were monumental, literally shaping the world we know. He gave China its name, its fundamental bureaucratic structure, a unified written language, and the ideological blueprint for imperial rule that would last for over 2,000 years. The Great Wall, though built upon bones, became an eternal symbol. His terracotta army stands as one of humanity's most stunning artistic achievements. But these monuments were born from a psyche consumed by fear and a philosophy of absolute control that justified any atrocity. The buried scholars, the burned books, the murdered intellectuals, the countless laborers worked to death. This is the dark underbelly of his glory. His quest for immortality led him to poison his own body, and his system of terror collapsed within years of his death, unable to survive without the tyrant's terrifying gaze. He was a man who conquered everything except his own demons, a god king who could command the world but could not command peace for his own soul. The first emperor's story is the ultimate cautionary tale of power. It forces us to question the price of unity and the nature of legacy. Can greatness born from brutality truly be called greatness? His tomb remains unopened, a silent testament to a man who still commands fear and respect from the depths of time. He achieved a form of immortality, not in life, but in the endless debate about his soul, a figure forever suspended between a god's glory and a monster's infamy. If these stories of power, madness, and the shadows of history compel you to look closer, then you belong with us. Subscribe to Forgotten Asia and ring the notification bell. Our journey into the forgotten past is only just beginning.